Thank you for joining this REI Systems webinar on data standardization and grant reporting. My name is Jeff Myers, and I'll be the Master of Ceremonies. Just by way of orientation, those of you hopefully are all through with any technical issues and can see the GoToWebinar icon showing the data standardization and grant reporting slide on the screen. At the top left, you'll also see a little GoToMeeting icon that will allow you to open out, and you can submit questions at any time during the meeting. However, we will be trying to answer those questions towards the end of the webinar. Certainly, if you have technical issues, you can submit those questions as well, and we'll do our best to see if we can resolve them in the meantime. What I would like to do is also mention that if you want, you can certainly, of course, take whatever notes or screenshots as you like as you go along, but we'll get a copy of these slides to you all within the next 24 hours. So with that, let me introduce our speakers. The speakers include Janata Spencer, who is a grant business analyst at REI Systems. She uses her interest in automation and data to help a wide range of government clients. In fact, she's working with grant managers in Utah, Toronto, and a number of other state and local jurisdictions around North America. She actually has some previous experience working with the Data Foundation and is pleased to collaborate with our second speaker, Hudson Hollister, who is the founder and the president of the Data Foundation and has been focused on a variety of different data standardization issues across the federal government, and especially in some of the ways that they interact with state and local governments and the private sector as well. He is significantly interested in trying to reduce burden and streamline reporting so that both corporations as well as state and local governments and grant recipients can do their jobs better and more easily. And in fact, he's been kind of a linchpin behind helping advocate for the Data Act as well as the Grants Data Standards in the upcoming GREAT Act. So I think you'll find him to be a fascinating presenter as well. Just for a brief bit of information on REI Systems, we ourselves, believe it or not, our company started out as a grant recipient. We received a Small Business and Innovation and Research grant from NASA about 29 years ago, and after seeing the results of our work within the 2 years after that, they asked whether or not we might use the results of that work to help NASA automate its grant application, receiving, and adjudication processes. Since that initial work with NASA, we've worked with more than 20 different federal agencies and at least as many state and local governments. We think, frankly, from REI's perspective, that the data standards that Jenna and Hudson are going to talk with you about will make life easier for us, but frankly also make life easier for most of our grant manager clients. Let me also put in a last plug. If you would like and you are not already on our invitation list, please let us know if you would like to get invitations to an every other month grants management breakfast that REI Systems holds in conjunction with George Washington University. Typically, a speaker will come from one or another government agency and talk about their successes, their challenges, their experience, and offer advice. And it's both a way to get some good information as well as to form a relationship and get to know some other grant managers so that you may have someone to turn to when you've got a question or a concern. Finally, within the next month, REI Systems, the National Grants Management Association, and George Washington University will be issuing our annual Grants Management Survey. We've done this each of the past 2 years, and we think that the results not only help inform members of the community such as yourselves, but actually inform and advocate for the interests of grant managers before the federal government. If you've had a chance to notice, within the President's management agenda, actually the results of our survey have been identified as one of the reasons that the government at the federal level should be focusing on or is focusing on reducing grantee burden over the course of the coming years. So we like to say your voice will have impact, and I'll encourage you to respond to the survey invitations. If you haven't received one in the past, again, please email any of the contacts with respect to this webinar, and we'll make sure you're on the list and invited to respond to that survey as well. With all that as background, let me turn it over, let me ask the slide to change, and I'll talk to you briefly about the agenda. The first set of topics, Hudson's going to kick us off and start out describing a little bit of kind of the background, experience with data standards and their implementation in the financial and spending arenas, and in particular the pilot related to grants management, the Section 5 pilot program. The second component of the webinar will include talking about data standards and bringing them to federal financial assistance, especially, of course, grant making. This section will look kind of at recent events, some of the current legislation and OMB directives that are in place, and their likely implications for what's next. And that then will segue neatly into a discussion of kind of looking ahead, what is likely to happen with data standards for grants, but most importantly, kind of what it means for you as grant recipients and how to prepare for it. With all that in mind, let me turn it over to Hudson and ask Hudson to begin on slide 4 with a review kind of some of the Data Act components.
Jeff, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I'm Hudson Hollister. I'm the president of the Data Foundation, and I am very excited to be talking with you about one of my most favorite topics in the world. And I think I'm going to start by explaining to you why this is it can be such a dry topic. We'll do our best to make it interesting. It can be such a dry topic when we talk about the specific data fields that the government requires grantees to report on condition of getting grant money. But I'll tell you why I care about it. If we were able to move from document-based reporting to having consistent data fields across the whole picture of federal grants, then the benefits would be immense. We'll talk more about the benefits now, but I'm bringing them up at the beginning because that is what motivates me. If the federal government were to specify the data fields and the data formats for all of its hundreds of thousands of grantees, including yourselves, why that means that your existing financial software could automatically compile much of the information that today has to be copied and pasted. Existing software could be upgraded to automatically compile and report the information that grantees are obliged to report to grantor agencies. Now, this is not rocket science and it's not science fiction. It has already been done. If you do your taxes using TurboTax or some similar product, you're seeing the benefits of it in tax reporting. In 2001, the IRS and the state tax agencies all agreed on the data fields that they were going to use for individual tax returns. That's what makes it possible for TurboTax and its competitors to help you automatically report on your taxes. The same thing is possible in grant reporting. Automation that reduces the copying and pasting and reduces the manual labor. And now what's the impact of that? If we had automatic grant reporting, that would mean that grantees could spend more of their time and more of their money doing whatever the work is that the grant is funding, as opposed to creating paperwork and sending it to the feds. The benefits for oversight and the benefits on the federal level are just as profound. If agencies have data instead of documents describing the performance of grantees, they'll do a better job of overseeing grantees. They'll do a better job of finding out the few that don't do a good job. They'll do a better job of telling their story to Congress and getting more funding, and they'll be able to communicate the impact of their grant programs to citizens. So all of these are reasons why we should care about data standards. And I'm going to tell you the years-long story, but don't worry, it's not going to take that long on this webinar, the years-long story of trying to bring data standards to the whole system and landscape of federal grant reporting. Now, our story actually doesn't begin with grant reporting. Our story begins with federal spending. And the reason for this is that in 2010, 2011, Congress began looking at the way in which all information about federal spending is tracked. Congress wanted to take the whole picture of federal spending and turn it from document-based and inaccessible to data-centric and fully accessible, machine-readable, and available to all. And grant reporting is one piece of that. If you look at all of the different types of information that help to illuminate how taxpayer money is being spent, you can look at the financial statements that agencies have to prepare and submit to the Treasury Department. You can look at the budget reports that agencies have to prepare and submit to the White House. You can look at the records that agencies publish up on usaspending.gov about your grant. And then another piece of that is the forms that you file with your grantor agencies and the audit packages that you submit to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. So grant reporting, or rather reporting by grantees, is one piece of the bigger picture of federal spending information. In 2010, 2011, Congress began seeking to pass a reform to take that whole big, vast picture of federal spending information and create a common data format for all of it. That is how the Data Act came to be. The Data Act is a law that Congress began working on back then, and which ended up being passed unanimously by the House and Senate and signed into law by then President Obama in 2014. Now, the original Data Act would have created one format for everything, one format for federal spending, one format for agencies' financial statements, one format for agencies' budget reports, one format for all the forms that you file as well, all the forms that you file with your grantor agencies. But that is not the final version. The final version only covered the information that agencies report. And so here's our summary of the Data Act. All the reporting requirements related to spending are too complex, Congress says, and that makes it really hard to bring accountability for the taxpayers. It makes it really hard for Congress itself to understand what's going on with spending. And that is why, in its infinite wisdom, Congress decided to enact this law. Three main provisions that the Data Act requires. First, and again, right, so far we're not talking about the forms you have to file, we're talking about the forms that agencies have to file. Big difference. First, the Data Act establishes standards. The Data Act says, when it was passed 4 years ago, it required the Treasury Department and the White House to come together and decide on data fields and a common format for all this information that agencies have to file with somebody. And I listed those off earlier. We've got a future slide that says what they are. And so I won't list them now, but suffice to say that agencies have a reporting burden, same as you do. The chief financial officers of agencies and other offices within agencies have to fill out forms and have to do reporting and compliance in a manner that isn't all that different from what grantees have to do. The Data Act says that there should be a common data format for that. And I've talked about fields and formats already, but we've listed a few of the things that are really important. The law says that the Treasury Department and the White House had to figure out what the common fields would be. Now, this is the dry part. In order to deliver all this transparency and all this automation, somebody has to sit down and figure out data fields, and that can be really boring, and there can be really technical discussions. The Treasury Department and the White House had to figure out what code would be used to identify account balances, and they had to figure out what the meaning of obligation is, even though agencies disagreed and differed about that, depending on whether you're talking about energy or defense or HHS or somebody else. That hard work was completed in May 2017, because that was the deadline. By May 2017, every federal agency had to start actually reporting the stuff. Every federal agency had to take those data fields and those data formats that Treasury and the White House had figured out, and the agencies had to start compiling one set of data files that described all of its spending and reporting those files upward to the Treasury Department. If you go to usaspending.gov, you will see the results. Because we have common data standards, because we have standardized data fields and formats, we now have one picture of the entire executive branch's spending. This was very hard to do because without the data standards, there would have been no way to take a particular account from the account balances and correlate that with the grants or contracts that are spent out of that account. The agencies, just like you do, agencies have many different systems and different types of systems, and there wasn't a connection between them or across them. With the data standards, with the common fields and formats, for the first time, that began to be possible, and now we have one picture that relates everything together. We're going to talk in a minute about how the Data Act didn't impose any new data standards, didn't impose common fields and formats on the reporting that you do, but did set up a pilot program to investigate that possibility. But before we move from talking about what the Data Act did for agencies to the future that the Data Act envisioned for grantees, I want to see if Jen or if Jeff have anything else to add. What are we forgetting? What am I forgetting about the Data Act? Anything else, Jeff or Jen?
I don't think it's possible for you to forget anything about the Data Act, Hudson.
I would add one thing.
I think, go ahead.
In the long term, I think the data standards will make it easier for you as grantees to kind of see where agency program priorities are And in the extremely long term, with the right level of transparency for you to say, hey, I spend this much money this way in my organization, I want to see how some other organizations do it. And before the Data Act and standardized data, that would never have been possible. I think gradually now the data is being collected in ways that that will become possible. And then again, with some transparency tools, that may actually kind of see reality. And I find that to be very appealing.
That's exactly right. And Jeff, I think I do want to describe a couple of things that our listeners, that our viewers on the webinar can do right now, today, with the tools that are already out there. If you go to usaspending.gov, you'll discover there's a whole lot that's now visible about spending that wasn't visible before. For example, usaspending.gov, thanks to all of these standardized data fields, can actually break down the entire government spending for a particular budget function or sub-function. For instance, if you happen to be a local transit agency and you're running buses, you could go to usaspending.gov and find the breakdown by budget function and find the transportation function, and then go all the way down to sub-function and find the ground transportation sub-function. And you could actually view the total amount of money that the federal government spends either by the fiscal year or for a particular quarter on ground transportation. That might surprise you. It would give you a way to put your particular grant in context with all the different functions. Another possibility for you, if you want to get a look at how, if you know where you're getting the money from, if you know which agency it's coming from, you might want to access the object class breakdown. Now, the object class breakdown is a little different. As you might know, if you've ever looked at the president's budget every year, the president's budget breaks down the object class for every agency and for every sub-agency. Object classes are things like personnel, salary and benefits, contracts, grants. You can use the object class breakdown to determine the entire amount that a particular sub-agency has obligated for grants for a particular calendar year, or sorry, a particular fiscal year or a particular fiscal quarter. You can look at the agency or sub-agency that is your grantor, and you can see the total amount that agency or sub-agency has obligated to grants in a particular time period. That can also help you put your grant in context. Not only that, there's a breakdown on USA Spending by recipient. And for the first time, just a couple of months ago, usaspending.gov began to put together all of the different recipients and hierarchies. So for instance, over in the world of contracts, if you take Boeing Corporation, there are 30 different companies with Boeing in the name. usaspending.gov now lets you see how all of those relate up to the parent entity. I know, for instance, City of Los Angeles. City of Los Angeles has about 30 different entities, and they all relate upward to the city government. I haven't checked this one specifically, but if it's working properly, you should be able to look at the City of Los Angeles and then see all of its different component entities that all receive grants, and you can roll that up into one. One more thing I'll say about usaspending.gov, there is now a state profile. You can go to your state and you can see the entire amount that your state has had spent on it for various purposes. That can really help you if you're working with a state agency, or you're inside a state agency and you want to see the entire breakdown of the money flow from the federal government to your state. If you are working on fighting for resources, or I'm sure I've got an easier way to put that. If you want more details about how to do all this, just go to datafoundation.org. That's my organization. The most recent blog post breaks down everything I just said. Now I think it's time to move on from talking about the future that is happening now for federal spending as reported by agencies, and let's move to the next slide and talk about what the Data Act does in grant reporting. Well, bottom line, the Data Act does not force all of you guys to start using common data fields and formats for your reports. You are still filling out these documents and still submitting these documents, but the Data Act does envision a possible future that would do that. Section 5 of the Data Act set up a pilot program, and that pilot program was supposed to be run by the Office of Management and Budget at the White House, and it was supposed to investigate whether it makes sense for the government to do the same thing in grant reporting as the Data Act had forced in agency reporting. Does it make sense for the federal government to move from a document-based world of grant reporting to a data-centric one? Should we adopt a consistent set of data fields for all these different reports that grantees have to fill out and file with their grantor agencies? Well, I didn't put the results, all of the results on this slide, but suffice to say that the answer is yes. OMB enlisted the Department of Health and Human Services to investigate this possibility and to run the pilot program. The Department of Health and Human Services went out and found 501 grantees, nonprofit agencies, state agencies, local governments, tribal governments, and it worked with them to take some of their forms and submit a data version of those forms instead of the document version. HHS went even farther. They actually went through hundreds of different forms and they tried to figure out what the data fields were across those forms. Now that's a hard job because a lot of the forms are in PDF. A lot of them are not in any kind of a system at all. HHS had to go through, they had to hire someone to do this, of course. They had to go through and they had to find each blank on each form and figure out and express that blank as a data field and then see what kind of overlap there was. HHS in this work isolated 34,000 data elements. That is, they went through all the forms for all of their own programs and they found 34,000 different data elements. Now, some of those data elements, like name of grantee or DUNS number, some of those data elements are used across many of the forms. There's a lot of duplication. Some of the forms, about 100 of the forms, are substantially duplicated by some other form. A few of the forms are exactly the same as some other form. And HHS looked at that, and OMB looked at that, and said, doesn't it make sense for us to not use documents at all, but just require those data elements? Because if we did that, then so much of the procedure, so much of the compliance cost could be eliminated for the grantees. You can read a lot more about this if you just do a quick search for the data element repository that HHS published, and I'll tell you what it's called. It's called the Common Data Element Repository, CDER. If you search for HHS CDER, HHS CDER, you'll find it. And those are the data elements that HHS isolated. Now, HHS tried to go to the whole government. I know they had other agencies working with them. That 34,000 figure does not represent the whole entire picture because not every agency helped them out. Not every agency participated. But because there is so much overlap in things like the SF 425 from agency to agency, we know that we've got a decent universe that could be built on. That's the recipient reporting pilot program. That's what happened under Section 5. And so if you hear people in speeches talking about the Section 5 program, that's what they're talking about. Before we head to the next slide, and I'll go a little faster after this, I promise. Jeff and Jen, do you want to say anything else about what OMB found and HHS found as part of that pilot program that was required under the Data Act?
I don't
and
have
it's okay
anything
if
to
not. We're all comfortable with awkward silences just as much as we're comfortable with streams of unending verbiage, which is my usual mode.
Yes. The Cedar, one of the things that was interesting about the Cedar Library is how many different ways the government has of saying the same thing or asking the same question. I think if I recall correctly, they found 7 different strings of words to request information about a congressional district. Or maybe 7 different definitions of a congressional district, but it was something very simple that has a very clear understanding that everybody thinks that they're all on the same page about, and they're actually much more contentious than you might think. And so that is part of the complication of all of this, but also once you get that down to one common definition that everybody understands, that's when things start to get a lot easier and a lot more interesting and really is going to let us do a lot of the things that we're talking about.
That's exactly right. If you go and read the report that OMB published about this pilot program, well, first, I don't recommend that you do so because it's boring. But if you go and read it, you'll see that OMB did do a good job of talking about the different benefits If we did define congressional district exactly the same way across all of these thousands of different grant programs and all the forms, then the systems that you have at your agency or at your organization could automatically plug that in wherever it's relevant. And that would provide a couple of benefits. It would mean that you wouldn't have to worry about a different way of defining congressional district in different forms, and that automation could happen. All right, here we've got a simple diagram, simple-ish, that shows the entire future that the Data Act contemplated. You'll see there's a dotted orange line down the middle. On the left side of that line, that's the compliance burden of agencies. That's the stuff that agencies have to report about how they're spending taxpayers' money. If you go to usaspending.gov right now, you will find information that reflects all of those blue arrows. Agencies have to report their budgets to the White House OMB. They've got to report their account balances to the Treasury Department. They've got to report their payments to the Treasury Department. They've got to report their grants to the Treasury Department. They've got to report their contracts to the GSA. That stuff on the left-hand side of the diagram, that's what's been standardized and transformed from documents into data already. Now, on the right-hand side of the diagram, that's the part that's not finished yet. The Data Act did set up the Section 5 pilot program, and that pilot program told OMB to go through and figure out whether data standardization is a good idea or a bad idea. And the report that we were just talking about says it's a good idea, but the Data Act did not force that. And so the right-hand side of the diagram is not yet finished, not yet accomplished. Let's go to the next slide, please. Oh, this one's fun. Talking about the systems that the federal grantor agencies report to. This is just a list that reflects what I just was describing in the diagram. Agencies, and again, let's have some empathy for the agencies. I know they seem to have much greater resources than you do, but they also have reporting requirements and they also have compliance burdens. And if you ever go to work for a federal agency, especially in the CFO's office or in the Deputy Director for Management's office or something like that, you will find that there's a compliance burden. Agencies have to report their financial account balances, their receipts, their payments, their grants. They've got to report their budget actions. They've got to report their contracts and their subawards. And now under the Data Act, agencies also have to take all that same information and put it into a standardized data file. Yes, that's right. If you were wondering about this, the new type of reporting, the standardized version, has not yet quite replaced the old document-based version. And this is a challenge. This is frankly a challenge. Even though for the last year and a half, agencies have begun reporting standardized data, they still have continued to have to do the old job. And as we think about a new future in which grantee reporting would be transformed from documents into data, we need to make sure to avoid that. We don't want there to be duplicative reporting. That is where we stand now with the Data Act. We're very happy with how it has worked out for federal agencies and to transform the information that agencies report. And the pilot program that was set up under Section 5 of the Data Act says it's a good idea to move towards standardized data for grantee reports as well. Now let's move to the next slide, and I think Jen has an observation.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So this is supposed to be much more dramatic in my imagining of how this is going to go. But basically, we do understand who federal agencies need to report to and what they're reporting to each of those entities. But we literally don't know all of the systems that federal grant recipients report to. And there are several reasons behind this, which I will now illustrate if you will allow me to take you on a brief journey back to high school civics class. Next slide, please. So this is the government. You're all familiar with it. But obviously, the government is big, and it is complex, and it is different and disparate in every way you can possibly look at it in terms of the agencies and the grantors and what they're actually trying to accomplish. Their hierarchies are confusing and often confusing to themselves. And so within all of these different offices, departments, and bureaus, not only is there a lot of difference between the goals and outcomes that they're looking for in their funding programs. So construction grants, childcare subsidies, healthcare, education, they all have very different outputs and outcomes. So the vocabulary there is going to be different regardless. There are always, of course, going to be certain things that we can talk about all of them, but by and large, a construction grants reporting is going to be very, very different from, for example, early childhood education. On top of that, each of those agencies and offices and bureaus that are giving out grants have different capacities in terms of the technology that they're using, in terms of their reporting demands. So each of them is different, both in terms of what they're asking for and in the ways in which they can accept that information. And then also, because so many of these programs or their progenitors started long before technology really had a hold in the government, a lot of their vocabulary, a lot of their terminology, a lot of their processes have grown up in silos. So they have established their own processes, their own independent ways of doing things, and their own independent ways of talking about what they're doing and about asking their recipients about what they're doing. And so all of that leads to a lot of confusion. And last but not least, the vast majority of these programs are dictated by statutes from the legislative branch. And each of those statutes has different requirements in terms of how often recipients have to report, what that reporting burden entails, who they have to report to, who oversees it. Sometimes programs move from one department or office to another, and that also creates problems with organization, process, and vocabulary. So long story short, the Fed has a lot going on, and it's all been done sort of independently with each different program or office or bureau, and it's created sort of a miasma of reporting. Next slide, please.
Yes.
Hudson, do you have anything to say, to add?
A great deal of frustration, and certainly if you look at the Cedar Library that we mentioned earlier, you'll see that there's some commonality. Most grantees do have to fill out the SF-425, for instance, and then there's some commonality that happens within agencies. For instance, everybody that receives a grant from HHS or from one of its components like the NIH, everybody receives a notice of award, and that notice of award, although there are some different versions, it's kind of the same, even across NIH, National Institutes of Health, versus the Administration for Mental Health, or the other parts, or the Administration for Children and Families, or the other parts of HHS. And so even though there's both variation and similarity across governments, the nice thing though, and the thing that we've discovered with the Data Act and with federal agencies, financial reports, different data standards can accommodate those differences. We can have data fields with flexibility. We can have a data structure that lets each type of program or each grantee or each different agency report the things that are common across the whole picture and give us much better comparability and transparency than we otherwise would have, but also have the flexibility to report those things that are unique to itself or unique to its own program. Kind of the same way in which if you're a construction worker or if you're a doctor, you an IRS form 1040, and if you're like I used to have a job when I was in high school, and I would fill out 1040 EZ, which is much simpler, but it would still have my name and it would still have my income on it. The same form or the same data fields that the IRS had specified permitted all sorts of different taxpayers to fill out the same form, and some of those things between me and the doctor when I was a teenager would have been comparable. In the same way, we do believe that despite this incredible diversity, it would be possible to use data standards to make things better. But I think right now, Jen is going to give us one more picture of the terrible complexity, overlap, waste, and suffering that right now exists in the world of grant reporting.
Yes, well, and I'm actually really glad that you brought up award letters, because they're a really, really good example of places that it would be reasonably easy to standardize. Sometimes down to the bureau level, grantor organizations have different letters of award. They all more or less contain identical information of who it's for, how much money, what it's for, when it runs out, what's the period of performance, how long after that can you bill. All of that is on this award letter, but it's not standardized. So you can find it somewhere, but where is different per agency. So basically, we just explained the current slide in a lot of words. But basically, everybody's reporting to different people, and it's confusing, and there's nothing centralized, and it's going all over the place. And even when people are correctly and in a timely fashion delivering their reporting and their data to the people that are supposed to be receiving it, it is nearly impossible to keep track of, and it is unbelievably redundant because it's the same information over and over and over, but it's on different forms. They can't be auto-filled. It's awful. You know this. So we are deeply hopeful that soon, through efforts like the GREAT Act and through the executive cap goal for results-oriented accountability in grants, we can do for granting what the Data Act has done for financial data. So next slide, please. Okay, so speaking of the executive cap goal, so cap goals are from the President's Management Agenda, and I have suddenly forgotten what CAP stands for. Hudson, can you remind me what CAP stands for?
CAP stands for Cross Agency Priority. And this is every 4 years, the White House releases what's called the President's Management Agenda. The most recent one got put out in February. And when the White House did this, they articulated 15 different goals for the whole government. And guess what? Goal number 8, CAP goal number 8, is all about grants. And it is the next step in our story. The White House, in this CAP goal, committed to doing the things that we've just talked about.
Yes, they did. And they actually produced a memorandum about this, which just came out, I think, in the past 2 weeks, which we will talk about in a minute. So basically what the results-oriented accountability for grants CAP goal is seeking to do is identify and standardize critical data so that we can have this beautiful future where we are better with our money, better with our performance, and better with our accountability. They are specifically focused on using the kinds of digital tools that we've been talking about that require data so that we can move forward towards that lovely future. One of the things that they are really trying to do, which I think is fantastic, is leverage things that are already there. There are, as we discussed, a lot of systems that are already in place. There is obviously USA spending and the related reporting that goes into that. But there are also a lot of other places that we can take what is already in place and leverage that to make things better and to slim down the burden. So basically, they have decided that by next year, I think it is, we've got the dates on the next slide, I think, but by next year, they need to come up with a really, is it this year? A really comprehensive taxonomy for the core grant management standards. Hudson, do you have anything to add?
I sure do. Let's go to the next slide and we can talk about what's happening with that.
Yes.
The White House made its most recent announcement in this project just very recently, September 5th. OMB released a new memo, Memo 18, number M, 1824. And I think it's just, if you ever found that those numbering systems mysterious, they're not mysterious. I think this is merely the 24th memo of calendar year 2018. So now you know that's the code. This particular memo was the next step for the goal that Jen has just been describing. OMB says, yes, we are going to have data standards. OMB promises they're going to publish those data standards. They're going to publish some data fields September 30th. So we are on the very edge of our seats waiting for that announcement on September 30th. Agencies have to figure out, once those data standards are published, agencies have to figure out how to implement them in their programs. So what does that mean for you? It means that OMB is going to come up with common data fields for the things that are at the very core, things like name of grantee, things like address of grantee, things like amount of money received in this quarter or in this fiscal year, other basic programmatic details. OMB is going to publish those data fields on September 30th, and then every program across the entire U.S. government, 2,300 different grant programs, all those program offices, including your friendly local grants program office, is going to figure out how to implement those data fields in its current reporting requirements. Now that is going to vary a lot for you. Some agencies have set up electronic systems that pull in all the information. Other agencies make their grantees fill out just PDF forms, and I'll bet there's some agency, some grants program somewhere that is still in the world of documents that has you mail things. Whatever the case may be, agencies have to figure out how to move from documents to the standardized data fields, and they will work to make it easy for you. For example, they might publish a web form that lets you put the information in, and that web form back behind will translate whatever you type into the data fields. There is not a big implementation coming. Instead, just an attempt to take the core data fields and align them across the whole government, because then that's how we push toward the future of automation for the grantees and better transparency across the government for the grantor agencies and Congress and the taxpayers. Now let's go to the next slide. Now, as is its wont, Congress is not left out of this action. The Grant Reporting Efficiency and Agreements Transparency Act, and that's an acronym for GREAT Act, was proposed in Congress earlier this year and has been approved. It was proposed in the House and approved by committee in the House. And if you wanted to boil it all the way down, the GREAT Act really just makes it mandatory for the White House to do what it's already doing. The GREAT Act says that the White House, except that in this case, the White House is required to do it with a partner agency. That's the part that's new. It says that the White House and the partner agency have to come up with data standards, just like what we've been talking about, and that they've got to publish the data standards, and that all the agencies, all the grantor agencies have to use those data standards to collect the information that they have from their grantees. Now, why does the GREAT Act matter if the White House is doing this anyway? Because the GREAT Act makes it definite. The GREAT Act is Congress saying, yes, we want you to do this. We're going to insist on you doing this. We're going to make it the law for you to do this. And we're going to set this as a long-term priority for the government, even if the administration changes, even if officials change, even if this particular management agenda that was put out by the White House is replaced with something else. We want you to do this. Now, I've got some breaking news on the GREAT Act. Just yesterday, the Senate, I told you that the GREAT Act was introduced in the House and approved by committee in the House, and so far no action in the Senate. Just yesterday, we got word of Senate action. The Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee announced that it is going to vote on the GREAT Act this coming Wednesday. That is September 26th. We also believe that we will see action by the full House and the full Senate shortly after that. And because there hasn't been much opposition, because there's a lot of enthusiasm to modernize grant reporting, we believe that the GREAT Act will ultimately become law. I'll say one more thing about the GREAT Act, and that it is a little more ambitious than the goal the White House is working on now. The GREAT Act says that single audit reporting has to be part of the picture. The GREAT Act says that everything, all this information that flows from grantees, not just the forms that go to the grant program office, but also the audit package that has to go to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. All of this should be turned into data and should be automated. It gives several years for this to happen. You can see it summarized here, but it does envision that it should happen. And that's all I've got to say about the GREAT Act. And let's move to the next. Oh, yes, here we go.
Sorely tempted to treat you to my Tony the Tiger impression, but I will decline at the moment. So basically, what all of this boils down to is this is an example of what the world might look like after we get all of this done. Because basically what having data does is it gives you a translator. Because all you have to do is say, this is the thing I want to know, and it fills it in. Obviously, you have to put in the information at some point or another, but that means that every single time you need to put in the name of your agency as a recipient, it just goes in. You have that data, it just goes where it's supposed to go. So a lot of time saving, a lot of typo saving, a lot of confusion saving would be possible. And it would make it so that everybody's talking about the same thing all the time. So there is no more vocabulary confusion. A data element would mean what it means to everyone. So when you're trying to do data comparisons, when you're trying to do, to use BI to understand your programs or to find trends, you can do that, and you can do it across programs if you find that relevant, and which I think a lot of times it's going to be. So, so this is what we're kind of aiming for. Next slide, please. So the question then becomes, how do we deal with that? As recipients who don't know what the data elements are going to be, who don't know when standardization is going to really start happening, who don't know what actual deadlines are going to be imposed, how do you start preparing for that? Because it's daunting. And it's a huge change, and it's scary. And there are 5 basic things that that we think you should kind of start thinking about, looking into, and putting into motion now, because what is clear is not whether the Data Act will pass in exactly the format that it currently stands in, or whether another initiative might supersede it. But what is clear is that the government is moving towards standardizing grants data. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it's going to happen soon. So what do you need to do to prepare for that? Basically, like I said, these 5 steps: inventory everything. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit in a minute on what everything constitutes. Make sure that your systems talk to each other and that your people talk to each other. One of the things that a lot of groups I've worked with have complained about is that their financial people and their program people just don't talk. And as an example of that, in the Fed, there is a bit over $1 trillion sitting in the PMS system, the payment system that a lot of grantor agencies use, that according to them is essentially dead grants. They've passed their period of performance, they've expired, et cetera, et cetera. But if you actually go in and talk to the program people, a lot of that money is accounted for. They've gotten extensions, they've gotten renewals, they've gotten any number of changes to their grant terms that actually that money is live and it's fine. But until we know that, that money is just going to sit there. So states often have similar problems. It often causes them to leave money on the table, which nobody likes to do accidentally. So making sure your people, your financial people and your program people really talk to each other is really, really important. Take standardization into account when you're making IT decisions. So both from an enterprise and from a agency perspective, this is coming. And as you start looking at retiring legacy systems, or perhaps starting to use an electronic grants management system, or getting electronic fiscal control systems in place, think about standardization, because it is coming. So when you're looking at systems, when you're looking at how you're going to implement those systems and what processes you're going to use, keep standardization of grant reporting in mind. Process engineering and change management, they are often considered sort of buzz terms, but they're real, and you're going to need them because one of the biggest problems that I see agencies running into is that when they try to do when they try to do a modernization from paper-based processes into a digital process or into a computerized process, what they actually do is they just pick up the paper process and make it on a computer. And that often is a big and eventually costly mistake. And then the last thing is to really start planning now how you can push data standardization to your subs so that you can use their data to do your own reporting. So those are the 5 big ones, and we're going to talk about those a little bit more in depth. Hudson, did you have anything?
When we talk to grantees, I think the one thing that we want to make sure that they understand is that the government, the federal government, has the burden for most of the big changes. Agencies are the ones that are going to have to make it as easy as possible to report data instead of documents, maybe by setting up web forms where applicable. So the most of the burden's on the feds. However, by doing the sorts of inventories that Jen is describing, by getting a handle on all the information, the whole picture of all the information that somebody in your organization has to send to somebody in the federal government, you can be positioned to take full advantage of this. You can automate faster than everybody else, and that means that your people can be freed up to apply their human skills and to execute grants as opposed to complying.
Yes, so we're going to pick up the pace a little bit as much as we can. So next slide, please. So first, inventory your technology and your systems. If you have electronic grants management systems, great. Agency-specific grant management systems. A lot of the state and local governments that I've talked to some of them have, agencies have their own. Some of them have one overarching sort of system. Some of them have one overarching financial system, but multiple grant management systems. Some of them don't have any grant management systems that are really, technologically cohesive. So you need to sort of look at what you're doing with those. Also, look at what federal reporting systems you're reporting into as a state or municipality, and understand what you're already being asked to produce. Also look at capacities. Each of your individual agencies or organizations are going to have different capacities from a technological perspective. As I just said, there's a huge variation within state and municipal governments in terms of who can actually do what from a technological perspective. And it's really important to understand not just who's ahead and who's behind, but where they might be able to meet in the middle, where you can leverage what you already have for one organization to help out another. Next slide, please. So when you're inventorying your reporting, you have internal reporting and external reporting. This is not news to you. But look at how your agencies collect your data from subrecipients. Are you already leveraging technology, or are you still in paper processes? What data do you collect for your particular unit of government, be it a state, municipal, county, whatever? What are you aggregating for the top level transparency and accountability in your particular government? And then what information do your current IT systems take in as data in terms of elements that are searchable versus PDFs or other attachments like Word documents, things like that? and really kind of understand what you have that you can already analyze versus what you may need to look into to truly digitizing. And then at the grantor level, what departments and agencies and offices does your government receive funding from? It's a surprising number of governmental entities that don't actually have a comprehensive list of that they can just pull up and know. The different federal systems that they report into, and how are those reports generated? How do you tell them this information is really important as well. Next slide, please. Once you have done that inventory, then you can go back and look in and say, where are there redundancies? Where is my government doing double reporting? So are there places where I'm reporting to the top level in my local unit of government, but also reporting that to the Fed? Are there reports that you have to create internally that mirror external reports, but you're not using them in that way? Are you leveraging subrecipient reporting to ease your federal burden? That is obviously the easiest way to make sure that data stays consistent, that there are no input errors, is just to push it up. So you're not picking it up and translating it into a different system. It's flowing on its own. And some of you may not be doing that at all because you don't have the technology, and that's fine, but know what you're dealing with. That's really important. Also, are you asking them the right questions, and are you asking them for data if you have the systems to do so, as opposed to still using PDFs and emails and documents that can't be searched? And then are you leveraging that internal data so that you can do your own federal reporting? Have you arranged the things that you're asking your recipients for such that you can easily push that up to the Fed? Next slide.
Jen, can I interject for a moment? We're going to try and kind of finish the presentation on the 60-minute nose. Those of you who have to leave, if you ask questions in the dialog box now, we'll certainly try and answer them. We'll be available a few minutes after as well, answering questions, but we'll also share those questions and answers in a written form with you along with the slides. So if you must sign off, go ahead and ask your questions now, and we'll answer them either online or as during the webinar or in writing afterwards.
Hudson's enthusiasm is not to be contained by time.
Or space.
So basically, once you've got all of that, once you know what you're asking for, once you know what you're being asked for, where it's all going and where it's all coming from, and then what you're getting as data versus what you could be getting as data, you have to rethink your processes. Again, as I said earlier, a lot of the mistakes that people make are trying to pick up paper processes and digitize them, and it doesn't work. It actually can often create a lot more problems. It can make it that much more difficult for you to turn that data into something meaningful, because often you're not creating data. You're still using the PDFs, and you're still thinking in documents, and you can't analyze a PDF, or you can, but it's remarkably challenging and not cost effective. And rethinking those challenges can be really, really hard. Rethinking those processes can be really, really hard, and it's very challenging. Often you don't know why you're doing something. It's just how you do it. So first you have to look at what you do currently, and then you have to look at why. And the why is the important part. Am I complying with a statute? Am I doing it this way to make it easier for the recipient? If I do it a different way, can I still keep it easy for the recipient, but also get my data? And it's the process transformation that's really the biggest challenge in a lot of ways. So next slide, please. Okay, so just some things to keep in mind when you're thinking about process engineering. Automation is a great way to save time and money, but you can't automate process that isn't data-driven. Again, please, I beg of you, no more PDFs, if at all possible. Just to be clear here, I've worked with a lot of recipients, and I know it's hard, and I know you don't like PDFs. I know everybody hates them. So you have to make sure, again, that your people and your systems talk. And to keep in mind, lastly, technically, recipients of federal financial assistance can comply with the GREAT Act without ever pushing these kinds of things down to their recipients. But if you don't, you're losing the automation, you're losing the data clarity, you're losing the opportunities to run those analytics and improve programs and find trends that you can't do without that data. So I believe we have now come to the final finish line. So Hudson, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Just that we're in an exciting time. We're at the beginning of digital reporting governed by data, not just in grant reporting, not just in federal spending, but across all sorts of exchange of information. This same thing is happening. If you have friends or colleagues that work in the private sector in compliance, the same thing is happening in regulatory compliance too in the US and elsewhere. And these developments will dramatically reduce the suffering of being a compliance professional. I'm going to put in one plug for our event. REI Systems is going to host a panel discussion live at Data Transparency 2018, which is just 20 days from today on October 10th. At the Mayflower Hotel in Washington. You can find details at datafoundation.org. We will have the White House OMB, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Commerce on a panel discussion of the transformation of grant reporting, and you'll be able to talk to the people in government who are doing this work right now. So if you have time or are in the DC area, please come to Data Transparency 2018.
So Hudson and Jen, we have a question, and the question is from the perspective, and all of you are welcome to stay on as long as you like. We promise that we will, of course, type these questions up as well as the answers and then share them with the audience members who are not able to participate after the 60 minutes. The question is, from the perspective of an auditor, what is proposed as an audit trail when data is captured instead of documents submitted to the pass-through entity?
I've got an answer to that, and I'm eager to hear what Jen says too. But the best way to answer that is to look by analogy at what is happening in the private sector. About 10 years ago, the Securities and Exchange Commission began requiring public companies to report their financial forms using common data elements. And this exact same question came up in SEC reporting. And the SEC decided to, for a while, exempt the data version of all those filings from the requirement of audited financial statements, and then eventually to phase it in. And the way that they have phased it in is that the SEC is now moving, instead of having public companies report a document that the auditors go over and also a data file that the auditors don't go over, they're now reporting a single version that has both human readable and machine readable elements in it. So it's like a web page. The thing that public companies report or are going to start reporting to the SEC now is like a web page. The data format for it is called inline XBRL, and it can be printed and read by a human. It also has the tags and the links embedded inside it. And so we don't have a full requirement yet for the auditors to audit all of the data tags, but because it's just one thing, it's just one electronic file that's both human readable and machine readable, that's the direction we're heading. I think the bottom line in the grant world is that it's taken the SEC 10 years, and so it won't happen right away. The auditors will not be forced to actually opine on the data structure and the data fields right away. It will probably be phased in over years for the audit packages that grantees have to report to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. Fantastic question.
And I'm going to take it in a completely different direction. And between the two of us, I'm pretty sure we will have answered. One of the things, obviously, that we worry about when we're implementing an electronic risk management system is that audit trail. I think part of what you're asking about maybe is version control, in that, oh, we made a mistake, we're changing this digit. One of the biggest things that I advise all of you to look out for, regardless of who you are talking to about an EGMS system, whether it's us or somebody else, is to make sure that that data doesn't get overwritten when you make changes if it has been submitted. Obviously, if it's a draft document, you can do whatever you want to. It doesn't really matter. But once it is submitted and you make changes, then that needs to have version control. That needs to have something that you can go back and say, oh, this was changed by this person on this date from this to this. And that's really, really important when you're talking to your subs, when you're looking at your own interactions internally, is to make sure that you have that audit level version control so that you can follow, we changed this figure because of this on this day. Otherwise, absolutely, this is gonna this will mess up your audit terribly. And that's why, like I said, version control is something that everybody should be thinking about when they're talking about any kind of data or grants management system.
Let me jump in with kind of one additional perspective, which is, although this may seem scary, on the other hand, you recall that 40 years ago, a lot of financial accounting was audited by kind of looking through books that were on paper. Eventually, the audit industry learned to live with the fact that most financial records are now kept in computers and software and databases, and they do two things. One is, of course, they audit the final figures, and they trace them back to kind of original data. The other thing they do is occasionally they will do tests and/or electronic data system audits to make sure that the computer system is acting appropriately and with integrity. So these problems actually have been solved before, kind of in the financial audit arena in the commercial sector. It's not hard to imagine how they may be solved within the kind of the grants arena as well. It doesn't look as if there are any more questions. I would certainly be happy if any of you in the audience have a question that just doesn't come to mind now but comes to mind tomorrow, if you forward it to us as the organizers of the event, and also you can see on the last page of the presentation, Jen's and Hudson's email addresses are there. We'll be happy to answer questions that you may have that don't arise in your mind until tomorrow or the next day. So please feel free to contact either Hudson or Jen or us here at REI Systems. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your tuning in and hope that you have great success moving forward with the Likely Great Act and with data standardization in the grant arena. So we're signing off, and thank you again for joining us.